Ladies and gentlemen, friends and followers of the Käte Hamburger Center Lawyers Culture, I'm very pleased to announce the talk of the forum tonight. As you can see, Politico-economic expertise in times of crisis on law and economics in EU expert groups. So we like very much expert knowledge, of course, even about experts and their specific cultures. So what are expert groups? Sociologically, we have to know what they are. How do they relate to elites? What are elites in this context? How do we relate the role of elites to the very profound questions we have about Europe? Of course, the question, what is Europe at all? A geographical space? Nobody knows. Of course, certainly not. The jurists will say it is a community of law. Of course, what else? Rechtsgemeinschaft, very clear. Others would say, no, that is not sufficient. It is an economical space, a market economy, and others. The culturalists. What are the culturalists saying? It is a space of symbols, of rituals, etc. Something completely different. Without those symbols, and others like Emil Durkheim would even say a space where people who adhere to this strange institution, strange space, transnational space, should be able to listen to a beating common heart. But that has been the question during the last years. Is there anything that can bring together people in Europe? Is there a commonness, or at least a belief in commonness, that we might need in Europe in order to solve the problems sometimes of some free rider attitudes that certain nations may have, and what is necessary in order to transcend such a perspective? Elites in this context, of course, some in the sociological theory of Europe have said what is really the most important is the consensus of elites, but how such a consensus is really able, and how can they prove their specific competence to merit such a specific integrative function in the same, perhaps not only integrative, perhaps also of resolving problems, sometimes crisis, banking crisis, etc. The history of Europe is also a history of crisis, I would say, and in this context, very often, it is about real facts, it's about real interactions, real interests, etc., but sometimes also about imaginations. The imaginary of Europe is much more important, also in crisis times. So, some years ago, I had the pleasure to work about the bank crisis of 2008 and the following years, by way of taking the central metaphor of this time that was used in all the newspapers and its discussions among experts even. The deluge had come, the deluge. How is it possible that in such a situation very hard economic facts had to be discussed when bubbles burst, etc. So that reminds me a little bit those words of this really very difficult period. That, by the way, I lived at Basel at this moment in 2008, the very day when it was announced. So whatever. Images, imaginaries, do they play a role? What is the role of elites in such a context? We haven't found nobody more apt to ask or to go in the direction of those questions that are not precisely yours, but I hope that I got a little bit of the spirit of what you are interested in. That Christian Schmidt-Wellenburg, a sociologist, actually situated at Potsdam University, with an interesting itinerary for all those. Daniel Witte is there. Hello, good to see you. Who is now in Frankfurt, and he hasn't been at our center for 4 weeks. I say it in public because everybody knows, and we are very welcome at the center. And I'm looking at him, also to other sociologists, because, of course, when you say you have been to Marburg, you have been to Dresden, you have been to Manchester, Humboldt University and Bamberg, those who are familiar with the scene will know who also stand behind. Whether it's Richard Münch, whether it's my old friend at Humboldt University, Hans-Peter Müller, or at Marburg and at Dresden. We don't go too deep into namings because we think ourselves to be very individual persons, and you are. Indeed. The illusion, the biographical illusion that I like to quote in this context, a wonderful text by Pierre Bourdieu, leads us to some of your theoretical orientations. I may just name two. One is really field theory, field theorizing, if that is possible in English, I don't know. That means to understand the social world by looking to different departments that are constructed at fields, how they do interrelate. I never understand very well. It is difficult. It's difficult for systems and spheres too also. So a lot of common problems in this differentiation paradigm that is also behind, of course, in the background of Bourdieu's theory, on the one hand. On the other side, it's about relationality, a relational theory of the social world. This is very fascinating because die Beziehungslehre of Leopold von Wiese could be named, but this Beziehungslehre of Wiese is really backed on the shoulders of Georg Simmel and his Wechselwirkungslehre. How to translate Wechselwirkung into English. So we make interaction of that, and it would come back as interactionism, but this is wrong. It should be relationism or relationality, and this is what you stand for. Let me just, in order to be not really too long and to bore you too much, quote some of the interesting works you have done during the last years. A publication about die Regierung des Unternehmens, Managementberatung im neoliberalen Kapitalismus. I think it was your doctoral dissertation, PhD, and that got the prize of the University of Bamberg as usual. I say as usual, at least with the people we work at the center in general, and congratulations, even if it is too late now a little bit. Internationalisierung der Betriebswirtschaftslehre an Universitäten und Hochschulen in Deutschland, Österreich und der Schweiz. That means also an interest really in economics and profoundly interest. And also an interesting work about evolution and social change with reference especially to Ratzmann and Niklas Luhmann. But what might be really for our current interests, especially and particularly interesting, is the next publication we wait for. This is Charting Transnational Fields Towards a Political Sociology of Knowledge, that will come out with Routledge. Very soon we'll have, we insist that the book will be in the library downstairs in the Durkheim Salon. I could go on with quotes about Europa und seine Krise als umkämpfte Objekte volkswirtschaftlicher Deutungen im Feld deutschsprachiger Volkswirte and so forth. But instead of that, I would like really to tell you how curious I am about conceiving Europe by way of looking at the experts. And this has also to do with the history of sociology. Saint-Simon, who was the founder of sociology, at least, I would say, for me, he's the real founder. He was, Auguste Comte was his secretary. He was a nobleman and who made some money during the French Revolution and who lost everything and who lived from the earnings of his former servants in order to survive. So he went through all the strata of his society, and this is his methodological recommendation of Saint-Simon. Unfortunately, sometimes also fortunately, it depends where you are. And this social stratum, sociologists have to do the same. It is, in general, a very good recommendation. But his idea of Europe and of societies, that they would be centered about industrials and industry, and even undermined and also furnished by a religious sentiment in his last writings, at least. As for Kant, makes me very curious where the religion will be in your expertise analysis. So thank you very much for being with us as a fellow at the Center. We could still yet profit from your insights, and will do it certainly further during your talk. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours. This is not very nice. I've taken this manuscript.
Well, so this will be hard.
This will be hard. So it was not a kind of a test. I could see something that is very similar. Sorry. This one is yours.
That's mine.
That's yours. This also.
So thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm not quite sure if I'm going to live up to the expectations you raised, especially about religion. Let me first of all thank you, Professor Gebhardt, Professor Detloff, for the chance of being here at this institution for the next half year. A really inspiring institution, an enjoyable institution. I found out that in the last 3 weeks, and hopefully also an institution where I can be highly productive. We'll see about that. Now, as you can gather from the title, I'll be talking about political-economic expertise and experts in the context of the European Union. And we've got that add-on, you've been talking about it, in crisis. And that not only references the 2008 crisis, it also hints at the general theme often invoked when political-economic expertise is called upon. So we are not confronting everyday problems in Europe, we are confronting extraordinary problems. So crisis is looming, and that is a regular theme in the EU context since the 1960s. And at the same time, in crisis also points to the underlying professional and disciplinary struggles I want to talk about today, that often accumulate in detecting a crisis of disciplines. And we've just had that with the discipline of economics, following the 2008 crisis. And that already hints at one of the main reasons why, in my opinion, we need a sociological, in addition to an economic, a legal or political science perspective or take on these issues, which will hopefully become apparent by the end of this talk. Let me start with 3 disclaimers. The work I'm presenting today is at the most work in progress, so please don't expect too much. Second, I'm not researching how academics, business lobbyists, civil society NGOs influence policy formation. That certainly is an interesting thing to do. I'm not doing that, and don't press me to do that. Third, I must confess, I'm really an utter novice when it comes to legal studies, when it comes to issues of law, so please be patient with me. I'll try to learn in the next half year. That said, what actually aroused my interest in these expert groups? Now, first, the reports by these groups I'm researching are widely referenced documents in the political, in the professional and academic discourse. And over a time span of 5 decades, starting in 1966, they practically mirror what at a certain moment is perceived as urgent economic problems and as feasible solutions. These expert groups hence allow me to take a diachronic and a transnational perspective on how something that might often is called the economy is discursively constructed, and as Professor Gebhardt said, that is one of the things that really interests me. So this perspective allows me to complement my research on national and international economic experts groups in the wake of the 2008 crisis that I've done in the last years. It gives the whole thing a sort of historical perspective. At the same time, it's not only about the economy, but about society at large. Diagnosing certain problems, as in the public interest, and searching for and implementing certain solution helps to establish a specific idea of society as legitimate, I would even argue as a sort of ontological valid thing, as normality. And last but not least, these expert groups are put together, or how they are put together, gives us a chance to glimpse at the underlying logics of who is seen as legitimate to define what the pressing problems of our times are at a certain moment in time. So what I'm envisaging here is a political sociology of knowledge, interested in how the structure of society is constituted, how it is impregnated, how it is produced and reproduced, not in sort of grand decisions alone, grand political decisions, but in everyday workings of political, academic and professional practice. Now, since the main aim of the presentation is to sketch a field theoretical, a methodological framework for my research, I will not come forward with amazing results. Instead, I will first try to sketch the phenomena in research. I will then talk about imaginaries of economic and social futures that can be found in these groups' reports. Afterwards, I will locate the groups in the field of bureaucracy, arguing that they should be understood as a field effect. And last but not least, I will shortly outline how I construct these groups as empirical research objects. And the presentation will end with a short conclusion. So that's hopefully what I'll be doing in the next 40 minutes. Now, what are European expert groups and why should we take a look at these? I'll give you three examples you probably know from 1970, 1989 and 2012. And the first one is the Werner Group of 1970. The committee to prepare the report to the Council and the Commission on the realization of stages of economic and monetary union in the community, as it is called in full. It was established in March 1970 by the Council of Ministers. It's got 6 members, which are all high European and national offices, all hold higher European and national offices. I could go into detail, I won't on these groups because otherwise I'm going to waste my time. And it suggests a plan by stages to achieve the following objectives, and I quote, to bring into being an area within goods, services, people and capital would move freely while monetary transactions carried out by businesses would not be hindered in any way or exposed to exchange rate risks. Second, it recommended joint actions in the field of economic policy, and that means simpler coordination, more sustained harmonization, common policies entailing the idea of shared risks, and therefore the need for common solidarity, as they call it. And third, it called for a common currency, although, I'm quoting again, it would hold together just as well to begin with if there were a system of guaranteeing that the exchange rates between the member state currencies were fixed irrevocably. It also involved setting up a capital market at the European level and a sufficient degree of tax harmonization, end of quote. The easiest way of achieving these aims would be, as they argue, through a European Reserve Fund. So that's one of the groups at the beginning. Second one you probably also know, the Delors Group, known as the Committee for the Study of Economic and Monetary Union, established in 1988 by the European Council, and the report was delivered in 1989, 17th of April. And it deliberately references in this report on, I think, 3 occasions, so multiple might not be right, but on a few occasions, the Werner Group and their sort of setting of the problems and problematization. The members are 12 governors of the European Economic Community member state central banks, and the group also encompasses Jacques Delors, at that time President of the Commission, another Commission member or Commissioner, one bank CEO, Alexandre Lamfalussy, at that time the manager of the Bank of International Settlement in Basel, and a professor as well, and another economics professor. And content-wise, it suggests a three-stage plan to reach economic and monetary union. First, the completion of the internal market. Second, a single currency. Third, a single monetary policy by an independent European Central Bank. And in addition, price stability should be the goal of the ECB, and banking supervision needed to be coordinated on the European level. So that was the second group that might ring a bell, and the third one is the Liikanen group of 2012. High-level expert group on reforming the structure of the EU banking sector, established in February 2012, consisting of 11 members, apart from Erik Liikanen, who is the governor of the Bank of Finland, ECB council member. We've got 3 members working as bank CEOs, 1 regulator, 1 consumer NGO, 1 person working for a consumer NGO, the CEO of EADS, the European, flying building planes thingy, and 1 working for KPMG, which is an accountant, and 4 economic professors. And the suggestions they come up with are stronger capital requirements for banks, preparation, approval of recovery and resolution plans by banks, with standards being developed and controlled by the European Banking Authority, legal separation of certain particularly risky financial activities from deposit-taking banks within banking groups, bail-in instruments, and what's interesting, a new macroprudential instrument, or instruments in addition to microprudential supervision of bankings. Now, you've heard about these groups. You've now got an idea, and what springs to mind when taking a look at these groups. To my mind, first comes that this constellation of these groups does vary a lot, meaning the job, the educational background, as well as the affiliation of these members. And second, at the same time, the major aims, creating a common market, reducing exchange rate risks, integrating economic and monetary policies, stay much the same, but if you have a look at the reports, you see that the narratives and justifications do vary as well. One important aspect of these variations are certainly the loose conventions in establishing these groups. So the only formal common feature of expert groups is their strict consultative function, the fact that they consist of people's statute. They've got to be external to the Commission by statutes. And in addition, the European Commission gives diverse reasons why certain members are selected, and that's some of the reasons given in a paper on the introduction of the group register in 2010. And I'm quoting, the groups of experts can be composed of the following categories of members. 1, members who have been nominated for personal reasons. 2, members nominated to present a common interest for people interested in a particular field. They do not represent the specific field. 3, organizations such as companies, associations, non-governmental organizations, trade unions, universities, research institutes, agencies of the European Union, departments of the Union, and international organizations. 4, authorities of the member states at a local, regional, and national scale. End of quotation. And that always reminds me of the Borges quote, The Order of Things by Foucault at the beginning. Everything's in there. At the same time, what is interesting for me is it does have an order. There is a logic behind it. It's not totally open. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to state it and publish it. The third aspect in establishing the groups is that they put a lot of emphasis on neutrality of group members. That is highly valued. Interest brokering is dismissed. Hence, any attributes of persons that have the air of neutrality will help getting selected. International or EU experience, being an academic, being retired even, holding multiple positions, having lived in many countries, things like that. Overall, I would argue that groups are hybrids interwoven in quite different sociologics. They are switch yards of authority, tying together agents that present quite different objective or objectified experiences. And the selection is open. Group constellations and that's an argument why I want to look at them, what group constellations mirror what is deemed as expertise at a certain moment. Because it is so open, you can actually have a look at what is for a certain issue at a certain time in a certain area deemed appropriate as expertise. Now, a second aspect of this, of the stark variations, are the different functions that these groups serve, and these are the functions that are mainly found in literature. First of all, they are seen as a resource in manpower as well as an expertise to feed the wordings of the Commission's bills. So it's practically writing the directives. Second, they are seen as a source of knowledge in certain areas not otherwise accessible, but needed for problem solving. They are means to test and work on the acceptability of certain initiatives. They are certainly a means to generate consensus of the issues among relevant actors in EU decision making to get the process of policy creation on the way. And last but not least, as a way of generating support or even democratic legitimacy for the European Commission. And that is an issue of heightened relevance in recent years with the discussion on the democratic deficit of the EU soaring. So EU expert groups have become part of the Commission's push for transparency and the construction of an EU civil society that grants legitimacy, something that's connected to the White Book of 2001 on European governance and the following projects by the Commission. Now, but in addition to all these functions, groups serve and manifest political struggles, I would argue that there is a second layer of struggles involved concerning the legitimacy of perceptions of society and those disciplines and professions eligible to formulate them. It is a sort of hidden struggle. It is also hidden by this appeal to neutrality and by this appeal to compromise in these groups. And this struggle is about the politics of social differentiation, social structure and social domination that sort of underlie the search for compromise, I would argue. And I wanted to argue that in order to get to this layer, we need to research the people involved in more detail. It doesn't help to have only a look at the functions of the groups. You have to take the members of the groups and have a look where they are, where they come from, what they're doing. And we need to research the subtle imaginaries of society, economy and politics behind the hands-on problematizations more closely in order to understand a sort of or to understand these deep struggles over what society is. So there I'm going for the imaginaries, for the discursive, or the discursive structures that produce these reports. Now, why are those social imaginaries important for European integration? I would argue that in order to take political decisions, and we can understand these political decisions either in rational or institutional terms, it doesn't really matter, one needs to be able to have an idea of what the future state of Europe actually looks like, be it positive or negative, integration. And as Jens Becker puts it, imagined states of the future, what he calls fictional expectations, inform decisions. They are needed in order to act because they reduce uncertainty and make uncertainty in situations manageable up to a certain degree. So I would like to argue that the one aspect underlying the functions of the EU expert groups mentioned above or before is their endeavour to make a certain future tangible in order for political decisions to be taken, for political decisions to be perceived as rational, not as irrational, and to be valued as legitimate. Hence, EU expert groups are, in my opinion, an arena in which agents struggle over differing imaginaries of political, legal and economic order, albeit not necessary in an open discursive combat. In the end, a shared horizon is articulated, and a shared horizon does not mean a unified worldview, but much more a sort of shared set of problematics, of ontologies, epistemologies, as well as accompanying narratives that allows for non-arbitrary, contentious position-taking in the wider political process. So it's the horizon in front of, it's the English picture, before which, in relation to which, you can actually have contentious politics. And drawing on the works of Pierre Bourdieu, one can talk about acts of symbolic domination via economic policy. Such forms of domination rest on a set of habitually shared imaginaries of the economy and politics and law of society as a whole, and it becomes of interest which groups hold which such imaginaries. But before we come to that, let us shortly take a look at changing imaginaries that have been associated with European integration over time and can be found, as I would like to argue, in parts and bits in these reports on EU expert groups. Roughly, I would like to argue that we've got three such imaginaries, and you probably have heard them before. This is not news, it's sociology. European integration in the first decades can be described, and you've mentioned that just in the introduction, as forming a community of law. And as far as I understand this, community rests on the one hand on EU legislation, hence on regulations and directives aimed at creating a common, aligned and detailed set of binding rules, at harmonizing member state regulation. And on the other hand, it is constituted by the production of law by the European Court of Justice, creating what was later to be called the doctrine of supremacy and direct effect, and establishing a dominant position of European law over national law. And the four freedoms are at the heart of this project, this community of law, and the main thrust is a form of, I would call it, legal integration that makes transnational trade possible and more efficient, that in the long run should lead to an integration of formerly nationally separated markets. So that is the idea why, or what law is doing in the context of markets, what kind of markets it imagines. Second, a second imaginary I would call integration by market, Europe as a single European market. And this took much longer to form. For example, Nicolas Jacquot argues that this imaginary had been around since the Treaty of Rome, but it took until the mid-1980s to be activated as what he calls as a convenient banner for coalition building at a time of stalemate, as a broad integrationalist political strategy that resonated well with many transnational, national, political, economic and civil society actors in the middle 1980s. Now market-enforcing integration was aimed at liberalizing and opening up diverse member state markets. And again, litigation does play an important and complementing role. As Kiliman argues, Euro-legalism resides well with this economic liberalization and at the same time with the political fragmentation that happens in Europe and is increased with new member states coming in. At the same time, in this imaginary, new forms of governance were introduced. As Höppner and Schäfer, for example, point out, and I'm quoting, binding directives and regulations that are subject to judicial review have been complemented by types of soft regulation in the late 1990s, such as the open market coordination. You've probably heard about that instrument. So here the shift is not only towards non-binding soft law, but also towards the participation of private, economic and civil society agents, and with a shift towards mechanisms of benchmarking and best practice. So in the end, the idea of the market has changed with this second imaginary. I would argue that this is now a single market that needs to be freed from obstructions in order for free market agents to integrate Europe. And that, for me, sounds different to the first imaginary. The third one, I would argue, is integration by agencies, Europe as a standard. Now, I would argue that at the beginning of the 1990s, EU agencies gained in importance as standardization and supervisory agencies. They became part of a specific EU governance regime. And although some opposition formed against such instruments at the beginning of the new millennium, once crisis struck in 2008, calls to limit their use were soon forgotten. So in the last decade, lawmakers have delegated quite some powers to these EU agencies, especially in the realm of monetary, of financial, and of economic integration. And I would say even up to the point where one might talk about trustees and not about agencies anymore. Prominent examples are the European Banking Authority, the European Securities and Markets Authority, the European Insurance and Occupational Pensions Authority, and last but not least, the European Systemic Risk Board. And just as with the new mode of governance mentioned above, a change in the logics of regulation seems to have taken place, best illustrated by complementing, in my opinion, micro with macro-prudential supervision in banking. The focus has shifted from monitoring and from sanctioning a single agent according to the conformity or non-conformity of his behavior to a certain set of rules. It has changed from this aspect of regulation to monitoring agents' interactions and interaction effects, hence populations of behavior, and influencing these populations of behavior by instruments of reflexive knowledge and incentives. Intervention is only reserved for those moments of acute crisis. So again, this imaginary of the market has changed. Now markets have to be regulated, I would argue, by market-like devices, because by now we have accepted that price mechanisms, even in financial markets, in near-perfect financial markets, are themselves susceptible to risk. Standardization is needed to buffer global shocks. Free single market agents need to be nudged. Sabine has been talking about that a few weeks ago. And they've got to be nudged or got to be sort of activated in order to create functioning markets. And the risk of individual failure is then part of the equation. It is accounted for practically. Now, as Daniel Mügge has concludes for the case of finance, and I'm quoting, the EU has installed, both nationally and supranationally, a new breed of financial supervisors and regulators as market guardians. And that is something different, where I would argue, as the idea of how markets are regulated compared to the other two phases. Now, taking these three imaginaries into account, no imaginary of EU integration seems to be possible without talking about law, markets and politics. But they do play different roles in these imaginaries. And in each imaginary, a different type of social order and governance is emphasized, one that is closely affiliated with a certain discipline, with a certain profession at the same time, be it law, be it economics, or be it more management, sort of. Now, up to here, I've been arguing that European expert groups are one of these arenas in which imaginaries of Europe are constructed, where they get authorized, where they're sort of kept at hand once you need them. At the same time, all those involved in these groups are part of an evolving European field of political and bureaucratic struggles. Something you could call a field of bureaucracy, or something that Didier Georges-Kaki has termed the field of bureaucracy. What do I mean by that? These people have been socialized into this field. They hold a position in this field from which they draw their resources to produce position takings and statements. By engaging European expert groups, they not only sort of discursively make Europe, but at the same time, in their practical political engagements, they make and remake Europe as a political field, as a field of bureaucracy. Viewed from a field analytic perspective, European politics has to be understood as the outcome of a distinct political practice, a practice oriented towards gaining and exercising political authority by setting, for example, European policy agendas, by influencing European legislation and governing European bureaucracies. And following Bourdieu, one could argue that doing that, they're doing politics always as two things. First, as engaging in producing the legitimate principle of vision and division of the social world, That means the legitimate relations and forms of domination between social fields, for example, the economy, politics, and law, between people, between classes and beliefs. And second, not being the only one doing so, that means holding a position vis-à-vis other political agents. That means being structured by these relations to other political agents, to other agents engaging in politics, by the experiences made in the past as well as these the imagined futures. And I would argue that is something, these experiences, these relations, that could be called political capital. And political capital stems from different sources. Political capital stems from votes, money, from company size, academic merits, even family names, party membership, and you could go on and on. Depending on the political field, and there the European political field is something different than the political field of Bonn. These become available for an agent's engagement in politics through different institutions, such as running for office, would be one institution of consecration. Working in state bureaucracy, another one. Lobbying politicians, generating media statements, even just plainly paying money. By engaging in these practices, one becomes part and constitutes political authority, and here, in this instance, a distinct European political authority. And this authority stems from a material, I would like to argue, and symbolic process of monopolization associated with imaginaries of Europe as a, for example, historical, social, economic, monetary, as a sort of spatial or societal entity. So, what I'm trying to do here is not, or I'm not trying to argue that the field of bureaucracy is cut off from national politics, cut off from the rest of the world or any other fields. Quite to the contrary, capitals accumulated in these other fields can be used in European politics, and the agents I'm talking about are multi-positioned. So, for example, you've got the MPs of the Bundestag, and they engage in European politics. Political careers run through communal, national, and European fields. Academics, especially those researching European issues, engage in consulting in Europe, engage in European politics, in order to advance in national academic fields, get a professorship. Taken together, this perspective invites us to think in complex relations, not in prefabricated layers or confined containers, and I think that's really important. And it allows us to position members of the European expert groups in the field of bureaucracy, much as depicted, hang on, there you go, that's confusion. Much as depicted by Georges Käte in his book. I don't know if you, have you got any chance of reading that at the back? Sort of. The idea,
with a fork and eye.
the basic idea is that you can locate experts when talking about the volume of political capital, high here, low here, the permanence of stay in Europe, high here, low here, or other important cleavages in this field, or differences like being member of an insider in EU institutions or an outsider, working in the public sector or being associated to business. In relations to these differences and other agents like up here, the President of the European Parliament, members of the Cabinet, you can locate the others, the other experts. And you can actually have a relational picture of what an expert is. And you can have a relational picture of what certain groups of experts would be. And they're not bound to be all in the middle, like Didier draws them here. This is a systematic representation. It does not rely on quantitative data. That's important to know. And you can think about how certain developments in recent times could be called, would mirror, would picture in this representation. For example, the managerialization or the externalization development in European politics. If you're handing out ever more policy development to expert groups, these expert groups become more important, or you can actually say that the externalization is going down here. So you've got also the possibility not only of picturing stability, but also to see changes in these fields. So the basic argument I'm trying to make is that we can, on the one hand, distinguish expert groups according to their issues, okay, but also to the constellation of experts, making it interesting to compare different constellations with regard to the group's function as well as the discursive outputs. On the other hand, these differing constellations may also show, if followed over time, the changing face of bureaucracy. So you can actually see how this political field changes if you look at the groups. So we can argue that certain engagements of expert groups or experts in groups are linked not only to their personal life history and trajectories, but to the socio-historical trajectories of their positions, to the forms of capital practices associated with these positions. And that second perspective opens up the possibility to link European integration and disintegration to struggles between professions and disciplines, because it's about the changes between the socio-historical trajectories of these positions, and they are linked to certain professions and disciplines. And that's precisely the point where, sort of, in my opinion, a field analytical perspective can shed new light on the development and proliferation of new forms of governing and governance in Europe. I think I've got another 10 minutes.
Certainly, yes.
So we're coming to the last part about the construction of EU expert groups as scientific, as empiric projects. What am I at the moment collecting? What am I looking at? The project focuses on 14 expert groups in the area of economic, especially financial and monetary integration, ranging from 1966 through to 2017. It encompasses 234 individuals. Now the question is, how are these European expert groups empirically constructed? First, to depict what is seen as an expert, information on these professional trajectories of all the group members are collected from CVs, publicly accessible internet sources and archives. The information is currently being coded in the grounded theory framework, so that means we are creating categories that allow to describe individuals according to their commonly held or divergent characteristics. And we're doing that for 5 different areas: national origin, education, academic and scientific background, political engagement, economic engagement, and civic engagement. And we're doing that for all different levels, communal up to OECD, jobs, and so on. And following this qualitative step of creating categories to describe the individuals, these categories can then be exported in order to construct a space of experts using the quantifying method of multiple correspondence analysis. That's what actually creates, if you've got data, these Bordeusian charts, fields, pictures, maps. And the main aim of employing this quantitative analysis is threefold. Using MCA, it becomes possible to determine the deep structure that organizes relations between different forms and amounts of capital, the sort of objective structure of the space. Because when you've got these maps, and they're multi-dimensional rooms, spaces, so we're talking about 99 dimensions, and we see the 2 most important, or the 3 most important. These dimensions are not drawn in advance. These dimensions are constructed in this multiple cloud as representing the points in the cloud the best. So you come at the deep structure of a space where you're able to grasp that, and then you've got to interpret it. It doesn't tell you what first, second, third dimension is. Second, it becomes possible to distinguish certain group of agents by their shared characteristics. So you actually know why a certain group is somewhere in this space according to which characteristics. And these insights can then be used to interpret agents' behavior, especially statements, returning to sort of the qualitative insights gathered while exploring and reading the material, coding the stuff. In a second step, the imaginaries, political problematizations, and governance modes used in the reports are analyzed using a discourse analytical framework, and that framework aims at reconstructing how objects are produced, how concepts are formed, how subjectivities are created, and how the discourse is articulated in these reports. So it's an idea of getting under the underlying structure in a qualitative way to show which reports have which ways of articulation in common, which reports have the same objects, construct the same objects, the same problematics and solutions. And the results of this qualitative discourse analysis can be used, on the one hand, for historical reconstruction of changes in a much more elaborate way than just telling you the story, like I did before with these reports. And it can be also included in the quantitative analysis, because you can attribute it to all the members of a certain EU expert group. You could even select texts by the people they published on these issues. And I've done that, but that's just such a hell of a work that I'm refraining from doing that in this project at that moment. Third, to be able to understand what expertise and experts are in these specific issue areas, in specific field or historical moments, it becomes necessary to situate the results from the first two steps in a historical institutional analysis, and here not only taking stock with the vast literature on the subjects will be of great help, or is of great help. In addition, there is archival material on European expert groups, quite a lot, including interviews even with members of the expert groups on their working and the establishment. And on the other hand, it does always help for the recent expert groups to get background information and background talks with people in Brussels. So this is the way I'm trying to construct these experts, these expert groups, and this European expertise as a scientific object, a relational scientific object. Let me conclude. Now, what have I been trying to argue? In the last instance, that the form of differentiation, the form of domination in society, sort of its basic order, could be said to be at stake in these European expert groups. Bold claim, but it's a conclusion. This means that agents not only produce more or less politically viable and useful recommendations, in my opinion, at the same time they produce and reproduce the sources of authority they draw on, as well as the relationships between these authorities. Sort of the autonomy of certain fields and the relationships between these social fields does correspond to a certain state of the state, I would argue. And that also I shouldn't have rewritten that in the last 5 minutes before holding this talk. The other thing is that I'm trying to argue is that at the moment the struggles over transparency and over economic expert groups that happens at the European level can also be interpreted by these basic underlying struggles, because we've got two sort of contesting views of these expert groups. On the one hand, there are positions with people wincing about the decline of the nation state and the democratic deficit of the EU. And on the other hand, you've got those who pursue a moral effort of creating new legitimate forms of governance, of transparency and commitment to civil society. And I would argue that both these positions are expressions of these underlying basic struggles over social differentiation, domination and legitimacy. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't bore you to death.